So, we're here.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So we're going to have a 20-minute chat about you, what you do and who you are. So sitting there we have...
Ian Adico.
Hello Ian. So tell us about yourself.
Well, I am classed as a paranormal researcher, which sounds more exciting than it probably is as far as I'm concerned, but I've spent the last 13 years full-time investigating the paranormal, mainly focusing on ghosts, but not exclusively. And that involves both paranormal research, but also events relating to the paranormal, ghost walks, ghost hunts, you name it. I've probably done it.
You've done it. So let's just break that down into the things. You've got the paranormal research bit, and you've got a paranormal research group. Is that true?
Yes, that's right. For quite a few years, probably 2001, I think we formed, and it's called the Paranormal Research Organisation UK. And since forming 2001, we have investigated some very, very high-profile places, including the likes of Devonport Naval Base and various sort of National Trust English heritage properties, things like St Lawrence's Mental Asylum, and it's been a very interesting period of years, if I may say.
So what's your team consist of, your research team?
We tried to have a balance, and within that there are the more sceptical, if you like, scientific, empirical approach people, which I would class myself as one of those. But on the other side, we like to have a balance with a few more psychical people, so perhaps the odd medium psychic, people who tend to use what I would call the more old-fashioned techniques.
Interesting. So in terms of the scientific techniques, what kind of stuff do you use? Do you use equipment?
Yeah, absolutely. From the sort of beginning, we started with various pieces of equipment, but we gradually built over the years to include equipment in terms of, you know, recording temperatures and humidities and things like that, because you've got to try and look for other explanations. You know, if someone's in a room and says, oh, it's suddenly gone cold, well, that's all very well, but that could be psychological. You need some empirical data. Right. But I think we're also the first group in the country, as far as I'm aware, that also tried to adopt a few psychological angles as well. So we did some questionnaire routes and sort of research from that point of view. So, yeah, it's very much trying to be all-encompassing, because it's no good just going on feelings and people saying, oh, well, I've seen this or I've heard that. You really need some kind of evidence to back it up.
Right. I mean, the way that I think about it, because we've spoken a lot previously to this, is the fact we've got the subjective stuff that we feel and we interpret ourselves, and that's personal and it's rich and it's vibrant and it can mean something and nothing. And then if I share my truth with you, then we need the empirical evidence to back up that what I'm saying is actually really out there, not just in my own bonds.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Yeah. And, you know, not to dismiss anyone, you know, people's feelings are genuine feelings.
Of course they are.
They could well be accurate. But for anyone looking at it from a scientific point of view, or, you know, a skeptic, you have to have something to back it up.
Yeah, and if we take that skeptic angle for a little bit, if you're okay with this.
Yeah, of course.
I have a challenge with equipment. Because one of the things, and I know that the Most Haunted television programme it set up a certain kind of attitude to research, thinking that you could wave various bits of equipment around on the evening and get these results that meant something. Of course, we know about baseline measurements. You need those. You need to know what the equipment is actually measuring. I mean, the one that makes me laugh the most, I think, apart from, well, actually, no, there's a lot that make me laugh, but the thermal infrared thermometers make me laugh, because they measure the surface temperature, and that varies. So in terms of the piece of equipment you use and the knowledge of what they measure, which is the most useful piece of equipment, and which is a piece of equipment that is actually used badly by most people?
I think as far as, if I start with the sort of negative side of it, I mean, I completely agree with you with the sort of laser thermometers and things like that. You know, I've seen people on other teams who have pointed a laser thermometer at someone's arm and suddenly got really excited because the temperature's gone up. You know, of course, not really relating to the fact that body temperature does tend to be slightly higher somewhat. And also another sort of piece of equipment which has become very, very popular in ghost hunting circles is like the K2 meter or the EMF meter. Yeah. And, you know, I won't name names, but I know a certain so-called paranormal researcher on a well-known TV programme who, on an investigation, I happened to mention to him this particular type of EMF meter wasn't very reliable, because if you suddenly moved it, it went off and showed a reading. And then a few months later, I saw the same fellow on this particular well-known TV programme doing exactly that, only not in the way that I had, actually suddenly saying to her, oh, this is really weird, look, this has suddenly gone off. And I have a problem with that because I think that's false. It's trying to imply things that aren't true, and really it's not the right way as far as I'm concerned, and I'm sure most people are concerned. As far as what would be a good piece of equipment, I think you have to have data loggers which are very precise, set up with a laptop, certain programs where you can have a constant monitoring of whether it be temperature or humidity or whatever, and really to make sure all of the other areas that are relating to that are precise and empirical, rather than just someone walking around the room waving an EMF meter and suddenly getting excited because they think they've got something paranormal. Yeah.
So as an extension to that then, one of the things that I know that, say, you think about this stuff, but some groups do not think about this sort of stuff. We know that EMF meters are primarily designed to detect AC current, for example.
Yes.
And if you're using an EMF meter as a ghost hunting tool, then you're making the assumption that ghosts emit AC current.
Absolutely. And also you're sort of making the assumption that ghosts are in some way giving off an energy relating to that. I mean, that's the principle, is that other people say, well, EMF meters will read other energies as well. Now, I would argue with that. No, they are designed and calibrated to pick up a particular type of energy, AC electric. Why would they actually be picking anything else up? They wouldn't be, because that's not what they're designed or scientifically designed to do. So, again, I think it's wishful thinking in the main part.
Yeah.
EMF meters, to me, are too popular. They are one of many, many devices which absolutely, and I would be inclined to use an EMF meter because, I mean, there's been research done by various parapsychologists that certain sound waves, electrical currents, can actually have an influence, or an effect rather, on people's experiences. So perhaps by measuring what EMFs, etc., are in the room, it's more so because if there are high levels, perhaps that could have an influence on the human individual, as opposed to actually assuming that they're being emitted by the ghost or the spirit, so to speak.
Yeah, that's the most intelligent summary I've ever heard about that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because like you, I'm interested in the paranormal. I've done some research and stuff. And most of the people who use the EMF meters, actually, they call them ghost detectors. I mean, that's what they actually. And you and I know that the environment has an effect on the human being, and therefore that's the focus of using these kind of background measures.
Yeah, and I think if people were using them for that reason, I would absolutely support it, alongside lots of other environmental measurers. But the problem is, as you just said, they're called ghost hunting meters, and really that's not what they should be used for.
I've got an app for that as well.
Oh, yeah.
Have you seen that? The other thing just makes me chuckle about the thermometers as well, particularly because, I mean, one of the things that I've heard people say is, well, if there's a hazy presence in the room, it will measure the temperature. No, it won't, because it will pass through there. They're designed to go through smoke. That's why the fire brigade use them, to measure temperatures of walls.
Yes.
So they don't detect anything other than the surface of a reflective... So temperature reflective surface.
Yeah, and if you sort of accept the common consensus that ghosts are ethereal, well, in theory, they wouldn't be picked up in any way before.
I am aware that when scientists use the word energy, they're talking about a very specific thing. But when mystics use the word energy, they're talking about something completely different most of the time. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean... energy in a scientific point of view, it's very defined. Whereas as soon as people say, I'm feeling an energy, it's very subjective in terms of, well, what exactly is the energy? And I don't think it's energy in terms of what Einstein would certainly talk about, but it's perhaps energy more really in terms of a feeling that they're having.
Yeah. I think that's spot on, and I think the language confuses people sometimes, because the mystics and the spiritual people or psychics will use it in one sense to mean the feeling, the subjective experience of, and scientists will then say, well, you can't measure it because it's not electromagnetic, it is not blah-de-blah-de-blah. And what happens then is the scientists fall out with the paranormal researchers because they're saying you're misusing the language. And in fact, we know we're talking about a feeling. You can't measure love, but it's still a feeling.
Yeah, it's a tangible thing, but it's not actually measurable.
Exactly.
Right, you say.
Yeah. So coming away from that, so you've got this team, the professional Paranormal Research Organisation, PRO UK. And is that the website?
We actually, at the moment, it's because we used to be had a much more public profile, and over the sort of last few years, we've tried to sort of pull away from too much media attention because it's not really the reason that we're doing it. So it's actually mentioned on a website, but we've deliberately not got a website that refers to it. So people can find information about it on one of my other websites,
which we'll talk about in a sec, because that's absolutely where this is going to go. So you've got your professional paranormal research organisation, which, as far as I understand, is a tight team of people that you invite in, that you work with mixed skills and approaches to collect information on possible paranormal events.
Yeah, I mean, you pretty much hit the nail on the head there.
Now, the other side, which is also interesting, because I fall in the same camp as you, really, we talk, is the bit that I would call it kind of entertainment, the ghost walky stuff and the ghost hunting stuff. So tell us a bit about the sort of spooksploitation bit of things.
Well, I'm a great believer, and I've had it levelled at me before. Well, if you're a skeptic, how can you do this? And I was referred to say, well, someone that does the Jack the Ripper tour in London doesn't have to be a serial killer. So with the sort of the ghost walks, for example, it's very much that I would tell a story, exactly what it says in the tin. It is a story. I'm putting across what people claim to have experienced, but that's not in a way to say, well, this is proven, because, as we all know, it's impossible at the moment to prove any individual ghost story. But I will offer all the different sides to it, the slightly sceptical view, but also what people have claimed to have actually happened.
Right.
But I think, with a ghost walk, you've got to be, how do I put it? You've got to be the sort of person that's right to come on that. The sort of person that will come on a ghost walk to listen to a few stories about ghosts isn't necessarily going to be the sort of person that would want to do a paranormal investigation. Yeah. So as long as you're very clear the differential, then I think that's perfectly acceptable.
I think it's very fair, because what you're doing is you're not blurring the edges. You're saying this is the research, and it's a dedicated team. This is the ghost walk or the paranormal evening, which is possibly educational, and this is how it would be done if it would be done seriously.
Yeah.
But you're not necessarily using that as a bona fide piece of research. You're telling people it's almost edutainment. It's entertainment with education.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, people can come. They can do almost a mini investigation, but it's not a report that's going to be published. It's just they're coming to experience a ghost hunt, a ghost evening. There's no guarantee that anything will happen. We're not going to put anything on. It will be as genuine and real as possible, but at the same time, because of the nature of the fact that it is public, we can't try to make it too scientific or claim that it's anything that it isn't. And I think there is a blurring with a lot of so-called paranormal research groups who set themselves up as a paranormal research. They come and do an investigation with us, and it's no different to what I'm doing in that they are just members of the public coming along and seeing what happens. But let's be fair, it's not really a proper investigation. There's nothing empirical whatsoever.
There's no structure to it usually. And
no, that's right.
I was aware of one group that I became tentatively involved with as their skeptic, which was a bit odd, really, because I'm a bit more open than being but they made me play that role, which is great fun. I don't like doing that. But the idea was that they would have invests. They called them invests.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah, they'd sort of market them as invests. Come on out, invest. And invest your money in our invest. And therefore spend lots of dough and spend the night in a darkened room with us, and, we will show you how all this is supposed to be recorded. And what it turned out to be was actually, it would have been better marketed as a spook show,
Yeah.
Because, I do the sounds recreations and stuff, and that's entertainment. It's not meant to be, should we say, factual. It's meant to be, you're going for the kind of telling people what it's like, telling people what was happening, but also saying, look, we'll just experience what we experience.
Yeah.
And it stays within this group. It's not that we're going to report it, not researching it.
Yeah. And I think, again, that's being honest.
Yeah. So the reason we've got you here today is that you are also, as well as being a paranormal researcher and this all-round cool dude, you are.
Really?
Yeah. I think you're a cool dude. I mean, you look cool. That's good. Yeah. I've got to describe this guy to you guys. He's sort of athletic, he's tattooed, he's got a designer stubble, and he's got that sort of hint of wisdom in the grey hair. It's incredible.
I think you're looking at the wrong person, to be honest. The athletic, certainly not.
Well, well, in comparison, look.
All right, in the scheme of things, no, I'm not even going there.
No, don't go there. But, so you've got the research side of things, and then you do the ghost walks. So the ghost walks has got a website name, so let's give that out to start with.
Yeah, the website for the ghost walks and indeed the ghost hunts is www.ghosthuntingcornwall.com.
Right, now since 1999, because I read the blurb outside.
Yes, that's right. It's been a while.
Since 1999, actually, that's over 10 years, isn't it?
It's 14.
14 years.
Yeah.
For the last 14 years, you have been running ghost walks and ghost walks in Penzance, St Ives.
And over the last 2 years, Falmouth. So originally, in other words, we could sum it up by saying I've spent the last 14 years walking the streets making some money.
In the dark,
yes.
Taking people up back alleys, yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Saying,
Quickly changing the subject.
Oh, look at this. Oh, that's spooky. For the last 14 years, you've been doing these ghost walks, which means that you've had to have done all the research in these areas to start with.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about some of the ghosts and the stories that affect this area, particularly in Penwith area, because that's what this show is about. The first thing is, how do you start researching for something like a ghost walk? Because Penzance was the original one, was it?
Yeah, Penzance is where I started in 99.
Yeah.
St Ives 2 years later, as I think I've already mentioned, Falmouth was 2 years ago.
Yeah.
I think when I first started, it was very much centred around researching historically, and of course trying to be as historically accurate as possible, but perhaps a few more of the traditional ghost stories, but also some eyewitness accounts and things like that. But I think over the years, as I've been very fortunate to become a little bit more well known, I do get an awful lot of feedback from different people, whether it's personally or emails or even occasionally the odd letter, where people are talking about their experiences. And so I think I've incorporated some of that over the years, but always being very attentive to making sure there's a frequency there. So there's no good, I get a phone call from some chap who says, I was coming home from the pub one night and I think I saw a ghost, and suddenly putting that in a ghost walk. It has to be that there are various sources,
right,
hopefully various witnesses, different places you can get it, to try to make the stories as genuine as possible. And, I say again, as genuine as possible. They are ghost stories after all. So I can't stand up and say, well, this is absolutely genuine 100%. But they're more likely to be genuine when you've got that sort of detailed source, if you like.
Yeah. And from a psychological point of view, that idea about something may or may not be true is more intriguing than something this is a definite fact. Because a definite fact invites immediate kind of sort of contradiction or scepticism.
Yes.
Where you say, well, down this dark alley, there just may be the sense of, and that sort of storytelling part, which you're obviously very good at, intrigues people, and it whets their appetite enough to get their creativity going, and therefore the questions that come afterwards.
Yeah, I think you're right, and also the whole sort of idea that you're not trying to be too dogmatic about anything leaves them open to making their own mind up. And then rather than you trying to dictate, well, it's this or this or this, there's a little bit of food for their own imagination to fill in the gaps, so to speak.
Right. So we're going to talk about some of the specific cases in a moment when we take a break, but some specific cases of ghost stories around here.
Yeah, sounds good.
Which sounds really good. Just a matter of interest, over 14 years, during the summer seasons, because that's when you work mostly, isn't it, for the ghost walks?
Yeah, that's when it's a lot busier, yeah.
Yeah. You must have had thousands of people traipsing the streets following you.
Do you know, I think it must have been, and it's a frightening thought to consider exactly how many. I mean, it's not possible, but if we could somehow get every single person that had ever done a ghost walk into the same area, I think it would be quite scary, the numbers involved.
Well, if you're averaging, I mean, I know you do more than this. You told me you've had 20, 30 or more at a walk, yeah?
I'd say that in the summer that's sort of minimum.
Minimum.
I mean, the most, I did have a 90 once.
A 90?
A couple of 80s this year, but that's quite an extremely large number.
So, even if you're averaging, say, minimum 20 people a session, right?
Yeah.
Over a season, you do how many a week?
It varies, but I'd say 3 to 4.
So, so 3 to 4 a week. So therefore, you can have at least a minimum of 60 to 100 people a week. a minimum.
Yeah.
And you've been doing that how many weeks of the year?
It's usually, well, it used to be April to October, now it's more June to October.
So June, so that's June, July, August, September, October. That's 5 months. So that's 20 weeks.
Okay.
So 20 weeks at 100 people per week. That's 2,000 people per season. Times that by 14. What have I said?
Doing really
I'm
good,
doing
yeah.
well. It's 20,000 people. At minimum.
So my jaw just hit the floor, actually, because when you put it that way, sense of perspective, that's a
hell of a lot of numbers. I will check the maths off air, but if that's the case, you've actually delivered your story and delivered the area. You've spoken to the area about the area to 20,000 people.
So really, it would have been a lot easier to hire Wembley Arena
and do it once,
and do it all just in one night, and save yourself 14 years of walking the streets.
Ian, and we're going to talk about the Penzance Ghost Walk. Ooh. The original and best since 1999. I've seen it on your poster. It says.
It must be true.
It must be true. If I was to come on one of your walks around Penzance, and provided you missed all the hills, because I walk very slowly, it takes us 3 weeks to get around, what would be some of the highlights of your walk? Some of the best stories, do you think?
I think it would be probably a couple that my favourites. It's always very hard to judge what other people's favourites are, but I mean, within the walk, it's about an hour and a half, and there's a lot of different locations, different stories, and it sounds quite odds with what I've said before, because I've said that I am quite a skeptic and all of that. Yeah. But actually, some of my favourite stories are the more traditional ones that kind of make you feel that it's very difficult now to gauge whether they are true, because they're quite old, and obviously I have a range. Some are quite up to date, some are far back. And one of my favourite stories, which, if I'm honest, I don't actually think is true, but it's a good story that absolutely sets people into sort of hair standing up routine. And it's actually Penzance Harbour. Right. And it's the claim that there's a black dog that's a harbinger of doom, a sort of portentous creature that appears to predict death.
Okay, I love this already.
Obviously, it's very difficult to have met somebody, because when you see the dog, apparently you die very quickly. Right. So it's very difficult to have a first-hand account, for example. Right. But the suggestion is it's been going on. And actually, when I've looked into this, the earliest recorded mention of the black dog of Penzance Harbour was over 200 years ago.
Okay.
But there have been apparent sightings at reasonably regular intervals, or every couple of decades, shall we say, throughout the sort of years, including one about 6 or 7 years ago. Now, obviously, that's a little bit too close to perhaps mention too many details of that. But it sort of ranges from a fisherman on his way to the harbour, seeing a black dog and then ending up dead within a couple of hours, to another gentleman who apparently saw him and then died the next day. And I personally think that it's a load of old superstitious nonsense, but it certainly is a story when I sort of tell it into detail and put in all the right sort of atmospheres. There's two reactions to it. There's either the same that I've just said, which is, oh, that's a load of old superstitious nonsense, or there's the people that say, I am never going to the harbour ever again.
Especially if I'm going to see a black dog. That idea of a black dog or a creature that portends doom and gloom.
Yes.
Are there records within that story of it being more than one person, like sort of ships going down, all that kind of thing?
No, I mean, all the accounts of that particular one, obviously the Penzance one, it's only been one individual. Right. And obviously we know, because at the time they've perhaps mentioned seeing a dog. And the suggestion is no one else will, even if they stood with that person. Only the person that's going to shuffle their mortal coil, so to speak, will be the person to see it. But it's interesting, because there are a lot of black dog legends around the country, Europe, and if you trace it right back, there are origins in Teutonic myths.
Yes.
And, one of the classic examples is the Hand of the Baskervilles, which is based on one of these black dog legends. But it's certainly not isolated to Penzance alone.
No. And I think that because that's worth going on to, there is often a cultural mythic background to a lot of these stories. So the black dog, for example, you've got the dogs that guard Hades, the
Yes.
guardians of the underworld.
Yes.
You mentioned the Teutonic myths, and triple-headed dogs and all that kind of stuff, and also the Egyptian idea of dogs.
Yes.
So
That's Anubis.
Anubis and that. So you've got this idea of creatures, supernatural creatures that bring ill or bring wealth. But we've got a black dog in Penzance that portends doom.
No.
We're all doomed, Captain Mannering. We're doomed. I like it. But for me, what you said there's even more interesting, the fact that you don't just rely on the story, the local story. Your knowledge extends back to looking at the origins of the original myth and noticing there are patterns in society.
Yeah, I think that the sort of research side of me comes into that, and perhaps it's overkill in terms of the amount of research that I do, because probably, I mean, certainly on the ghost walk, I wouldn't be going into details of that sort of thing. But I think you need, if you're going to stand up and tell a story, you need to have the background information to that. One, for your own sake, because it's fascinating stuff, but also there's a lot of people out there that ask lots of difficult questions, and I think it's professional to be able to answer as many as possible to the fullest of your ability.
I agree. And the ability to abstract a statement of a local legend and place it in the context of, if you like, the collective unconscious or the global mythic structure is really important.
Yeah, completely, yeah.
So you mentioned the research there, because you've got a background in social science, isn't it? Is it
Yes,
your
degree in human sciences, yes.
Yeah, so that sort of fuels your research interest, and I guess.
Yeah, I guess that's probably where my research techniques were based around, and I think I sort of adapted that to what I now do in a slightly different way. But in a kind of way, it's different to science in that there's the sort of hypothetico-deductive method and things like that incorporated into the human sciences, but also there's that whole argument of, well, is it a science? And so it gives you a little bit more freedom to explore slightly different techniques than just an absolute empirical.
Definitely. So you've got the qualitative versus the quantitative, basically. And I think one of the things that we're beginning to understand in terms of psychological research is that narrative, that qualitative stuff is really important.
Yeah.
You've got to capture it somehow. And even if it's anecdotal, you've still got to capture it and pull out the strands from that.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. It's almost like being all-encompassing and having as much research and information as is humanly possible.
So we got off the black dog there, partly because I was scared of seeing one when I go across the harbour later on. Black dogs portending doom. So that's great. So I can see how that would actually grab people because, fluffy dogs and, So another one. Go on. Have you got another one that whets our appetite locally?
Again, this is probably a more sort of traditional one, but it's actually St Mary's Churchyard.
Oh, right.
And the origin of the story was 1832, when actually there was a cholera outbreak, and eventually this led to or as they called it, a cholera pit, but also a cholera grave being built in the churchyard. Now, to sort of give the succinct version of this story, all of a sudden there were lots of people apparently walking through St Mary's Churchyard back then, claiming to see this sinister white figure, of course assumed to be a ghost, which led to a lot of them screaming and running out of there, superstitious times and all of that. Many of them described these sort of doleful sound, groaning noises, and apparently a few of them witnessed this figure floating off the ground and so on. But to cut a long story short, this led to a lot of people avoiding the churchyard through fear, except one guy, and apparently this chap, a young sailor, one night taking a shortcut through, saw this alleged sinister white figure. Only unlike the others who turned and ran and screamed, he didn't. He approached the ghost, in inverted commas, and asked two questions. Who are you and what are you doing? But allegedly the ghost replied. And in answer to the first question, who are you, he actually replied, I'm a ghost. And in answer to the second question, what are you doing, he allegedly replied, I'm haunting a churchyard. At which point this young sailor, who, you got to give him some credit because the others, he didn't run away, he decided to test this idea that if you were to meet a ghost and try to touch one, we've all heard it, that your hand will go through. Only he didn't just settle for a little of a tentative touch. He thought the best way of finding out either way would be to punch him as hard as he could.
Typical sailor response, perhaps.
Of course. Yeah. Probably after a few
bevies,
sort as well. Only, I'm sure you know where this is going, he connected with something solid, and this turned out to have been a local prankster in a white sheet. So, in many ways, I think he got exactly what he deserved. And, of course, a lot of people felt very, very foolish because they'd been scared of the apparent ghost. Only, the interesting part of the story is that over the decades since, there have been regular reports of people claiming that they have seen a white figure, including, and I've got copies at home, people writing into the Cornishman and various claims that they have seen it ever since. So either it's a family tradition passing the white sheet down generations, or maybe there is still something going on.
Can you imagine? It's sort of, my son, everything that you can see in front of you belongs to you. It's my son, here's the white sheet, no order. Now, I think that again is really interesting because that harkens back to this notion of urban legends, doesn't it?
Which also sort of ties in with the black dog. It's almost like the urban myth these days are the same equivalent. There are generic stories. You've got your white lady and your sort of your grey monk and things like that, which do crop up in widespread areas. But there's very, very similar basics to each of the stories.
Which also the skeptic in me, or the researcher in me, or the psychologist in me, makes me think that that's more interesting than the possible supernatural thing, because it's to do with the human psyche and the need to create identities and sort of frameworks in which to put experience. The story that you just told, the fact that it was a prankster, that's the bit that's documented.
Yeah, that much so far has been referred to in quite a few sources at the time. But that's the interesting thing. How many people in the scheme of today know their local history, know those stories? And that's the sort of idea that you've got to look behind. So it's all very well different people writing to the corners and saying, "Oh, well, I've seen a ghost in St Mary's Churchyard." Did they have knowledge of that story?
Yes.
Even if only subconsciously, maybe they'd read it years ago and forgotten about it. If they genuinely had no idea of that story beforehand, that makes it a whole lot more interesting.
Well, that certainly does, because we know about the cryptoamnesia stuff, the stuff we can read and then forget stuff. But you're right, that's stuff that has kind of like a lineage from a story where they may not have done the research, may not have bothered to read, and it's become a tradition that's talked about that then creates the experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'm always very, very wary of people who go to a so-called haunted location and they know all about it, and then they claim to see the very figure that's traditionally been recorded. It's not impossible that they did, but it's very unlikely.
I think belief in a thing actually makes your perceptions shape the things that you're seeing in the world to what you believe. Completely. So belief is about perception, not perception the other way around. So we got this kind of wonderful story of the shrouded figure in St Mary's Churchyard, which I kind of like. I kind of like that. And when you tell the story, I'm assuming this is night time when you tell the story and stuff. Do people gather around and start looking?
Yeah, it is fascinating sometimes from a psychological point of view to see people's reactions. And there's been occasions when we've been in a place and people have perceived that they've suddenly seen something, and they may well have done. In fact, that particular location, there was one night years ago when I was telling the story and I had my back to the grave in question, but all of a sudden the people, there must have been about 25 people, all seemed to react at exactly the same time. And when you're looking at people, there's something going on. And I sort of stopped and turned and I saw absolutely nothing, but they had all claimed that, and this is the key thing, all of them had claimed to have seen like a misty figure behind me.
I love it.
Now, my sort of sceptical side was that it probably was a genuine formation of mist for a few moments, not long enough for it to still be there when I turned around, but they'd seen the same thing. The fact that they were hearing a ghost story, the mist had been in the same place, that they had actually, in their own minds, linked the two.
Yeah.
But at the same time, because often what you find with ghost sightings is it's not everybody.
No.
If there's 20 people there may be 2 or 3 that claim to have seen the same thing. And you've always got to say, well, did they know what the others had seen before they described it? But to actually have 20, 25 people all seeing it, I think it was a genuine, tangible mist rather than anything ethereal.
I think you're right, and they interpret whatever it is in the context of what they're hearing rather than what they're thinking. It takes me back to the where the Sister Fatima appearances in Italy,
Yes.
and when the sun apparently moved.
Yes.
So hundreds of people saw the sun move.
Yeah.
It was probably an optical illusion shared and then retold because of the shared experience. And it was given meaning because of that. So, fascinating. So we've got this dog that would, as a story, that's great because it hooks people into this kind of, bain't be strange things down here,
And it's great when you're actually on that harbour,
Yeah.
and once, in a blue moon, somebody does, by coincidence, turn up walking a black dog, and people's reaction tends to be awesome.
Yes, there was a facial expression between the awesome bit there, guys. You won't pick up on radio. You see, the entertainer in me would set it up every time. They'd say, get a friend who's got a black dog, who just come down to, or train a black dog to come up and sniff you and then run away.
It is. I do agree with you. It is very tempting. I've always shied away from that.
Yeah, I can understand why.
I think it's something that would have to be done well, because otherwise it could become quite tacky.
It could
if you
become
did it the wrong
tacky.
way. But
Yeah, one of the people I know, a guy called Noel Britton, who does the Bristol Ghost Walks.
right.
He's a very funny guy, and he's also a magician. But he balances, I suspect like you do as well, the kind of the story that's got the heavy emotional hook, the story that's got the kind of comic hook, and then at one point he tells a comic story. And he's got a little dog in a remote control car that actually drives up. And it just finishes the evening off with a laugh, and it's kind of nice. However, back to that. So then we've got this sort of white spectre of St Mary's Church, which has become an urban legend, perhaps, or part of that, or maybe. It's where the guy got the idea to do the prank as well, because was there a pre-existing legend to the prank?
I've always wondered about that, because I've not found anything in any sort of historical source, but I guess you've got to look at it in two ways. Was there a story originally, or is it just the fact that people tend to be quite unnerved by cemeteries, churchyards? I mean, Hollywood has sort of capitalised on this spooky appeal of a churchyard. And if you take the sort of general feeling about ghosts and spirits, it is that they will be haunting or hanging around, if you like, where they either died or lived. So actually, if you take that to its logical conclusion, why would a ghost be haunting a churchyard? Because, I don't feel that they'd have been hanging around there when they were alive.
Well, they wouldn't be reminded they're dead, perhaps. I've no idea.
But then also there are certain cultures that believe that the soul does hang around for a set period of time. So depending on when burials took place, I think it's probably more likely that the perfect setting, if you are going to try to scare the hell out of somebody, a churchyard has the right aesthetic quality to do that.
Yeah, and I suppose if you go back in time to the sort of 1800s, we've got this kind of, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, really, especially down here. We've got that kind of disconnect between the spiritual life and the practical life.
Yeah.
We've got high mortality rates. There's no, it's perfect breeding ground for the birth of spiritualism, which happened in the 1800s in America, that whole idea. And I think the context in which that developed was because of people needed some answers that science couldn't provide, and they'd be disconnected from their religion. Yeah. So, and the notion that your spirits or your ancestors in churchyards, all that kind of thing, makes those churchyards really exciting places.
Oh, completely.
And you said there was a cholera pit as well?
Yeah, and it's actually that's where the sightings were happening, and I think the idea was that it seemed to start at that moment. So whether the suggestion was that it was that someone was haunting the cholera pit, or perhaps this being built and the number of deaths associated with it, maybe was the inspiration for this guy to pick that as a location.
Yeah, that when I've spoken to, and I know that you have people who, like in the fire service and the police service, ambulance service, who see horrific things. They have a kind of gallows humour about it.
Yeah, completely.
And it may well be the response was the gallows humour.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very relevant point.
Yeah.
Possibly.
Interesting. So, well, let's do one more. We want to steal your ghost walk off you. Can you tease us with one more of your of a story that has an impact, or story that?
Would you like me to stick to Penzance, or?
Well, you can move outside of Penzance.
Further afield. Let's do a St Ives one.
That's a nice one. That's in the area, yeah.
So this by many, or for many people, they call this St Ives' most famous ghost story.
Right.
And it involves a white horse. Now, originally there was a gentleman called Mr. Birch who lived roughly around just over 200 years ago in, obviously, St Ives. And by all accounts, he owned this beautiful white horse, which he took everywhere he went. And most evenings, he would ride down to Porthgwydden Beach via Island Road, where he'd dismount from the horse, go for a quick swim, horse would wait for him, and they'd ride back home. But one particular night, and you've got to appreciate that by then, there was a routine to this. It'd always be about the same sort of time. But one night, long after they'd have usually gone, people saw the horse standing alone on Porthgwydden Beach. So they were naturally quite concerned, rightly as it transpired, because Birch had drowned that night. So this horse had been patiently waiting for his return, which wasn't going to happen. Now, eventually the horse was literally dragged away from the beach, because apparently he didn't want to go, was taken on by other people in a stables nearby, and lived for several more years. But this is where the story got interesting, because as soon as the horse died, there were people regularly, and they say that in the early days, hardly a week went by where there wasn't somebody walking down Island Road towards Porthgwydden Beach, claiming they'd seen a white horse. And yet, if they'd follow it around the corner to see where it was going, no sign of it. And then later, the same evening, when something like that had happened, another witness would then have claimed to have seen a white horse going the opposite way down Island Road, but with a huge difference. A figure of a man riding the horse. Claimed to match the description exactly of our old friend Mr. Birch. In fact, several witnesses claiming that they had known the guy when alive, so could be absolutely definitive about this. Now, in the early days, they said that hardly a week would go by without this happening. So the sort of general thought was that the horse was going to Porthgwydden, collecting his owner, Mr. Birch, and then the two of them, as ghosts, were heading the way they always had, and the way they surely would have done if this tragic drowning hadn't taken place. Now, I have over the years done that ghost story on the Ghost Walk in St Ives, and a few years ago I thought I'm just going to try a little experiment with this, and what I would do is stop the group before Island Road, and all I would ever say was, right, I'm going to have a walk down the street. I'm not going to tell you anything at all until we get to the end. I want you to listen and pay attention to anything that you may hear or sense or whatever. Now, the reason I did that is because I've not heard of too many sightings of the white horse as used to happen in the old days, but I have heard of people in houses there, people staying, claiming to have heard horses' hoofbeats. So my experiment was to see how many people, when asked afterwards, well, what did you say? What did you hear especially? What they come up with? And as you can imagine, you get all sorts of different things coming up when people put their hands up. But the interesting thing is, I would say on average, 2 out of every 3 tours I do, somebody in that group says horses' hoofbeats. Of it's still a privately owned castle. The history of it, I mean, there was originally a manor house from the middle of the 12th century until probably about the end of the 16th century, and the manor house was then destroyed. The assumption was that they used a lot of the stonework in the building of what is now Penwith Castle. Right. So around about 1500, maybe a little bit later, probably 1530 actually. And originally, it was a very influential, very important place, you know, sort of alongside St Michael's Mount and probably Godolphin House. But unfortunately for the Penwithics, the family line eventually ran out in terms of male heirs. Right. And obviously, traditionally, in those times, it would always be handed over to the male heir. And one of the eventual Penwithic lords had 7 daughters, all of whom had been married out. So there was no one to take the castle on. And over a period of approximately 200 years, it was left deserted, isolated, and gradually fell into disrepair. A lot of the stonework was probably stolen by local farmers in the building of barns and so on. But the tower remains, and it's very important historically. It's also claimed to be the most haunted location in the country. Always a difficult label to substantiate, but it's got so many myths, legends, and ghost stories. It's an absolutely fantastic place.
So, let's get this straight. The Penguith Castle, manor house from the 12th century, thereabouts. The Penguith family, quite an influential family, because if you're living in an influential place, I assume influential people. They eventually died out. Their line died out because the final lord, whatever, only had females, so that the estate fell. About what sort of time would that be?
Off the top of my head, that's probably about mid-18th century.
So when did this Griggs character come into the story? The alchemist character? That
would be, I mean, again, assuming that we're talking about John Millerton. He was the guy that originally built the castle tower as stands today. So we're talking around about 1500 onwards. So
John Millerton was a family member?
Yeah, he actually married into the Penguithics, but he eventually took over the whole estate. And I think at the time when the manor house was gradually falling into disrepair, he took over. He came into some money, and it's still not absolutely clear where from. So assumingly he probably turned lead into gold or something.
Oh, yeah,
I don't know. And then he built the tower. And there is an interesting story because around about... I mean, originally it was always suggested that Penwith Castle was built in about 1500. But recently they've actually had some dating done on some of the beams in the tower. And we're talking more around 1530-ish. Now, the interesting story about that is, about that time, there's the local story about the King of Portugal ship, the St. Anthony, which went down off Cornwall.
Right.
And the rumours at the time were all of this gold that was being carried on the ship, which was actually the King of Portugal to pay his troops, went missing. And the rumour was that it was the Lord of Penguith, Lord of Godolphin, and probably the St. Albans at St. Michael's Mount were heavily involved in this redistribution of wealth, shall we say.
Oh, very Robin Hood-like.
Yeah, completely. But actually, now that the dates have been swapped around a little bit, that ties in because all of a sudden this castle and this great hall was built at Penguith. Interestingly, Godolphin also built their great hall around the same time. So it would appear that both families certainly did come into a lot of money from somewhere.
That is really interesting.
But of course, it's only a rumour.
It's only rumour and supposition. We don't know, but that's a very interesting story, interesting rumour. I think it's also interesting about the gentleman that was considered to be an alchemist coming into money, because that's another reason why at those times people thought if you suddenly gained wealth from whatever source, they attributed it to magical arts.
Yes.
Because Nicholas Flamel, the guy that's immortalised in the Harry Potter stories, but he was a real alchemist.
Yeah.
And he amassed a lot of wealth, and everybody attributed it to alchemy, but in fact it was money laundering. He was a money lender. And he kept that bit quiet. And of course it's better to be an alchemist.
Far better reputation as an alchemist than a money launderer.
Until the Inquisition comes along, and then you've got problems.
Yeah, you might just change your mind.
So we've got Penwith Castle now in the sort of 1500s, getting the tower built.
Yeah.
Because of the wealth, and then from 1500s onwards, that's when the family started to go into decline, I guess.
Yeah, there were still first generations after that, but probably within 200, 250 years, that's when it eventually started falling into complete and utter disarray.
So that takes us into the 1700s, thereabouts.
Yeah, I think more or less off the top of my head.
Yeah, okay, yeah, it's good. So then it fell into disrepair, and what, it was abandoned, the whole property was abandoned?
Yeah, it was abandoned. And it also ties in, and I think this is probably where some of the original ghost stories started, because when it was abandoned, there has been archaeological discoveries, including a tunnel underneath the castle, which led to Prey Sands Beach, Smuggler's Tunnel.
Okay.
One of the cottages nearby is actually called Carter's Cottage, the infamous King of Prussia.
Yeah.
Carter. So I'm kind of assuming that, let's say, if you're up to no good, you've got a smuggler's tunnel, in an abandoned building. What better way of keeping folk away in superstitious times and maybe a few ghost stories knocking around.
Wonderful stuff. Now, explain a little bit about Carter and the King of Prussia.
Well, he was a very famous smuggler, and again, I've got to try and think off the top of my head, but I think it's sort of 19th century.
Okay, so 1800s.
Yeah, and he was nicknamed the King of Prussia, partly because he was such an influential figure in terms of smuggling, but his childhood home was actually the cottage adjacent to Penwith Castle.
Wonderful. So we've got, if I understand correctly, you've got archaeological evidence of a tunnel. Because I've heard about these smugglers' tunnels in lots of places.
Yeah.
And stately homes are meant to have tunnels. And half of them are not. They're just local room. But in this case, you do have an archaeologically discovered tunnel which runs from Penwith Castle to Carter's Cottage, roughly.
Yeah, so and from Praesands Beach. And
Praesands Beach.
Although, as I'm sure you can guess what I'm going to say, it has been capped off, so there's no... But there is still the original part of the entrance on the beach, but the entrance that would have been in the adjacent property, Carter's Cottage, that's been completely covered over.
Of course it would be, but the fact you've got the entrance and you've got archaeologists, if you like, verifiable stuff outside of local folklore saying this existed.
Yeah.
And of course, your hypothesis is superb, the idea that ghosts would have kept the locals at bay. So any strange lights in the night?
Yes, I think certainly that is the case. And, it's kind of turned on its head because these days, if you have a ghost story, it attracts people in, as I know too well.
Yeah.
But back in sort of 18th, 19th century, superstitious folk, especially Cornwall, inevitably it would have kept people away, I'm sure.
And, of course, the church would have helped that because it would have actually talked about ghosts in a negative way and sort of evil. Right. Yeah. So the sort of Methodist approach would have actually... Yeah, I like that notion. And
that actually links it, because a few years ago, the owner of Penwith, Angela Evans, sadly died about 6 or 7 years ago. But I remember an occasion when the local vicar turned up at the castle, and his concern was because a lot of his parishioners had been talking to him about the ghosts and so on. So he'd turned up with this idea that he would help to deliver, or exorcise if you prefer, the ghost of Penwith. And Angela, dear old Angela, turned and poked him in the chest and said, "This is my castle, and these are my ghosts. Now," I can't say the word that she used, but
go away.
Radio, go away, effectively. So again, that whole sort of church link, it's all coming back.
Now, I mean, we just need to make clear, you are linked to Penwith Castle as a trustee of the current estate.
Yes, I actually these days I'm a trustee, because it's since Angela died, it's now a charitable trust, the Penwith Historic and Education Trust, and I am one of those trustees. So
you are your dream is to restore it to something of its past glory and then restore the history.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're trying to do at the moment. We're trying to take a twofold approach. One, to bring it back as historically accurate as possible, focus on Tudor, because obviously that was when it was originally built. But also the other approach to that is within Angela's dream. So Angela Evans had an amazing passion for the castle, and we want to try to also incorporate that into our plans. Right. But as with everything, it's very much funding dependent. It's a charity. We're trying to get the right funding to get everything done, but it's getting there. And the phase 1 works have taken place. Phase 2 will start very soon. But of course, it is a Grade 1 listed building. Yeah. It's also an area of outstanding natural beauty, ancient scheduled monument. So the restrictions in place, the only southwest equivalent is Stonehenge. So obviously it takes an awful lot of bureaucracy, and I say that in the nicest possible way, to get things done.
Okay, so that was a bit of a surprise, actually, that the fact that Penwith Castle has those qualities about it, and only matched by Stonehenge in terms of its restrictions.
I think it is only Stonehenge and Penwith has all of those
the triumphant
various factors.
Yeah.